A bright light illuminated the cut in space, and a man with a sword in his hand stared at it. This room was called the Grave of Newbies. A creepy training thought arose in my head about this. The iron robot's eyes lit up red. Everything kept saying there was danger, and everything around was sparkling, saying and ringing about it. The clawed hands clasped together. The sentence of salvation sounded from the speakers. The young man with silver hair rushed towards danger, sword ready for defense. He glanced to the side. Here his abilities were limitless, and this gave the man pleasure. He swung his sword, and the light from his sword spread. He used his attack methods in this place. The blow hit the target, in the middle of the robot. The divine power dominated the field. In flight, he saw absolutely everything. His sword fluttered and poured out light when attacking the robot. Attacked him. He stopped, clutching his weapon tightly in his hand. Mission accomplished. Protected. A smirk appeared on his lips. The smile became wider. He laughed, told everyone that it was all over. The man was not a newbie. They accepted him. A few months ago, the men were sitting in an office talking about errors in documents. Leaner turned his head and smiled, showing the pen that he had specially prepared for signing this paper. The man sitting next to him winced at this, whispered discontentedly, and looked arrogantly at the boy. He noticed, raising his glass, that this was not how business was conducted, and that they needed to drink, not rush to think it over. Linar had a severe headache, but in order to appear carefree, he nodded in agreement, without really thinking about the words. Sweat was running down my face in beads. My whole body was shaking. I was clutching my pen tightly. The chills were preventing me from thinking clearly and considering the deal. He suggested playing a game and scattered checkers across the table with one movement of his hand. But then he stood up abruptly, picking up his bag, realizing that the signed agreement would bring harm to the company. Linar left, and the man on the sofa angrily waved his hands, splashing the drink, and remained indignant. Blood gushed from his nose, and curses and indignation from the man flew at his back. The one who was left without a contract swore too loudly. The boy was born with divine powers. He felt the aura of other people, and noticed danger. Grandma warned him that he could become possessed by God, and warned him not to get involved with someone like that. She put a cold hand to her forehead and asked not to tell anyone about anything strange. As he walked down the stairs, the young man had a headache, and memories of his grandmother flashed through his mind. There was an accident ahead. A car collided with a truck. Black smoke filled the street. Standing in front of the photographs of his parents, the man was sad about the long day, clenching his hands into fists, his back tense. Linar's eyes filled with tears. He reproached himself. He had to feel that the failure concerned him. He asked his parents for forgiveness, walking in surprise on the soft carpet of flowers that stretched out before him. Seeing his mom and dad walking away from him, he tried to catch up with them, shouting and calling out, and didn't understand where they were going. A huge, fiery hand stopped the man, touched his shoulder, and he fell into a stupor, stunned. A guy, a complete copy of Linar, sat down next to him and warmly asked him what he wanted, his tone soft and unobtrusive. He extended his hand to him and pleasant words flowed. He can fulfill whatever he wants. You just have to wish for it. A cry of pain escaped from the open mouth. The eyes flared with yellow light. The body rose even in the air. He woke up in his grandmother's arms, had a seizure, and then his strength began to grow and manifest itself more and more. He sat down on the stairs, wiping the blood from his nose with a handkerchief. It was a shame that he couldn't use it. Linar and his friend were drinking at a bar. The guy told him about his dismissal, no longer feeling any emotions about it. Pouring alcohol into a glass, he couldn't do anything, otherwise he would be considered crazy, and it was sad to realize this. My friend was also fired, but he didn't talk about it calmly. He angrily slammed his hand on the table, almost spilling the glass. Ben waved his hand. He was offended by the betrayal. He lost all his ardor. He deflated like a balloon. The conversation continued. They remembered the game, and even invited us to come back again. It was a great time. Linar really thought about it. It was the best thing in his life. He remembered his chair and the shouts, and continued to chew. Ben remembered why the guy had quit the game. He shrank and apologized. The bitterness of resentment clouded him. He turned around anyway, asked about the capsule, everyone is playing it now, and began to enthusiastically tell me about the new game. And then he spoke furiously, pointing to his head. The body is not needed. Even people with disabilities play. Linar propped his cheek with his hand. He needed money. He decided to try it after all. The next day, in the computer club, doubts overwhelmed the boy, but he carefully pushed them away. He smiled while his friend was closing the capsule. Everything will be fine. He didn't lose heart, and tried to think about the good. The young man found himself inside the game. His hair turned silver. He stopped, putting his hands on his hips. Now he had to pass a basic test, and looked around in surprise. Time passed. but nothing happened. He folded his arms across his chest and sighed. Everything seemed strange to him. Ben was watching the guy, thoughtfully wondering about the reason for the stop, and had even started to get nervous. Finally, the boy ran. His friend assessed him well for the first time, and he looked at the screen in fascination. He deftly dodged all the traps without a single mistake, as if he belonged here. Everything was too easy, and Linar reached the finish line too quickly. Ben began to tremble. Sweat ran down his face. The boy took third place in the world. He didn't know how it happened. He grabbed his hair with his hand. If he hadn't stood still for a few seconds, he would have won first place. The young man's eyes flashed with a yellow gleam. Divine power raged within him. He was a damn genius, his friend thought. Before the start of the race, the path opened up before the guy, and he saw all the traps as if in the palm of his hand. Dodging the traps, his eyes were already watching the next trap. He deftly turned and jumped over them. He skillfully controlled every part of his body, and the divine power manifested itself more strongly. He did not feel any recoil at all. Dodging the trap, he opened his mouth and was surprised that he was able to pass through so easily. He stopped, the finish line, looked at his entire journey. The boy wasn't even tired. Opening my eyes, emerging from the game, I felt tired throughout my body, I thought strangely. Ben greeted his friend with a shout, amazed that it was his first time in the capsule, and was able to take third place. The guy was coming to his senses while his friend was nervously throwing up his hands, regretting that he hadn't filmed such a run. It would have gotten a lot of views. When he turned to Linar, he continued to shout anxiously, now about the boy's well-being. Taking his hand away from his face, the protagonist did not understand why there was no recoil, while assuring Ben that he was completely fine. I savored those very feelings of liberation of power, how wonderful I felt, and was able to manifest myself. Having left the game, the feelings were not so much brighter. I was upset, and at the same time did not understand. He clenched his fist, his cheeks turned a bright blush. He laughed, closing his eyes. It seemed he understood all the fun. Ben walked Linar away and waved his hand with the phone across the road, asking him to think very carefully and not miss the opportunity. The boy smiled faintly, waved back, and told him not to exaggerate. I remembered the character why he stopped playing. His powers were expressed by recoil, and he fell helplessly in front of the computer. He was thinking about the capsule when a headache overtook him, and some kind of premonition came over him. I noticed a girl with a bright red aura of danger. She was falling down the stairs, awkwardly waving her arms. As soon as Linar saw this, he immediately jumped up and grabbed the baby by the stomach with his hand. Fear was on her face, and his. The girl's mother ran up, hugging her daughter and thanking the guy. Everyone around was whispering about him, wondering who he was. The happy little girl left with her mother, but she didn't stop waving to the man, and he didn't mind either. He also said goodbye. Sweat ran down his face in large drops, looking at the recoil, thinking whether he could do without it. The boy sat down and pressed the back of his hand to his lips, and it seemed as if the red aura was penetrating and approaching him. The hunched guy was sitting on the ground. People were walking around. No one noticed the yellow glow that was coming from our character. Since childhood, he was involved in sports diligently. He needed a healthy body and mind. Ben's scream made Linar suddenly unclench his hands and jump off the horizontal bar. His friend was shouting loudly and shaking his phone. He put his hand on his hip and shook and showed the phone to the boy, who only sighed deeply and rolled his eyes. Rubbing his neck with his hand, the boy made excuses that his face was not visible there. Ben did not listen and puffed indignantly. The guy's eyes widened when he heard that the video had spread all over the internet, and he stared at his phone. I watched my miraculous rescue of a girl and received a lot of support from strangers. He immediately remembered those feelings of victory, the great jubilation as when winning a game. He raised his head and called out to Ben, telling him that he would take it on again and needed an assistant. He'll put everything on the last chance. A barely noticeable smile appeared on the guy's face. He needs to make a good stream. The next day, Linar bought the capsule. Ben was surprised, because this item was too expensive. He sat up in his hospital bed, surprised by such immersion in the game, a new one that had been updated and was now popular among young people. He closed his nose with his fingers, felt a strong smell of blood, and this also surprised him. They added this too. Pulling the catheter out of his hand, a blue board lit up. He was welcomed into the game, and Linar responded to this with politeness. His eyes widened. He heard about the newcomer, covered his mouth with his hand and whispered in fear. He shared that the information is presented at the top. Everyone can see the player's level. The feeling of danger appeared. He grabbed the standing dropper and his strength, as expected, also began to appear. He grabbed the IV with both hands and decided to check it in the corridor. He heard some noise. Peering cautiously out from behind the slightly open door, I exhaled and noticed that something was actually happening there. Ahead, I saw a man in uniform, holding a pistol in his hand, not revealing his presence, hiding behind the door. But the man turned his sweaty face towards the guy, felt him, and shouted that they needed to run away and quickly. Linar came out with an IV in his hands, realizing that the policeman was his ally, of course. He would have been calmer with a gun. The hero ran towards him resolutely. He still wanted to get a weapon. His heels sparkled. But first, the character had to deal with the zombies that were getting closer and closer, and he squeezed his weapon tighter. Although they laughed at such a reckless newcomer, he no longer read, but his eyes lit up with a yellow divine light. The advancing zombies' eyes glowed blue. Their mouths opened in a silent scream. Blood dripped from the corners of their mouths, and the smell of rot was very strong. Ben sat on a chair, crossing his legs and nibbling on a cookie. Bars reveals himself differently after death. He suddenly jumped up, adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose and leaned forward towards the computer, cursing loudly. The main character leaned towards his weapon, keeping count of the zombies he killed, but there was no end to them. He turned around, struck the 7th subhuman, and looked around with an inscrutable face. His eyes lit up yellow and everything became clear to him. He only had a few more to kill, just 3. A zombie was approaching from behind, the smell of a corpse accompanying it. It opened its mouth and extended its hand towards the man. Our hero was not fooled. He deftly dodged and turned towards the monster, piercing him with the weapon he had with him. Having finished off and smashed the skull, he continued his count at the number 8, still holding the same IV drip, used it to the end. He lifted another zombie up, piercing it through and through, already the 9th monster in front of him. Waving the IV like a sword, Linar stopped at the 10th zombie and dealt with them all. Wiping the dirt off his cheek, his feelings returned to normal. There was no longer any danger, but the people in the chat could not understand who the guy was. He lifted his face. It turns out it was a quest to save a policeman. The zombie had to be killed in a minute. Our character did it in 35 seconds. A smile lit up Linar's face. He closed his eyes. The training had been too easy for him. He turned at the call of the policeman who shouted at him to stop. It was time for their meeting. He asked about his health, reached into his pocket and tried to get something that would be useful to the boy. He handed over the access card to the police storage facility in the basement. The guy was surprised, but didn't show it. Hidden road, new, will pave the way, people wrote in the chat, glanced at the blue square. He showed the map. It was in his hand. He needed to move forward, but Linar smiled and showed the object. The policeman put his hand to his mouth, coughed, but walked, moved next to him. And the hero said that people began to suddenly die, and their bodies began to rise again. He glanced sideways at the boy, removed the handkerchief with blood from his mouth, and grinned. His time had come, he sadly noted. Linar noticed a bite on the policeman's leg. The man clenched his hands, and one could only guess why he didn't say anything. While he was still conscious, the cop shoved a gun into the hero's hands, his body shaking. He asked to practice, walked away, stretched out his hands and ordered not to close his eyes, to shoot. This trembling man aroused admiration. He conducted shooting training, showed the right way. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. Linar didn't think he would get a gun in this way. When he finished with the policeman, he turned around halfway to the basement. He was actually sorry that everything turned out this way. He opened the door to where he was heading. It was time to explore the basement. The other players supported him. A blue sign appeared, warning of danger, and Linar opened his mouth in surprise. They were prompting him. The first donations started coming in, and people in the chat even laughed at the boy and thought he was cute. Pointed a gun. He just speaks directly and openly. Let them laugh at him now. His hands fluttered over the keyboard buttons. Ben wanted to cut a couple of clips, and he felt childish delight. The man smiled madly. It was time to make Linar famous, so he was now working on the video. Ben pushed himself off the chair, praised himself. His friend should thank him. A good partner. A couple of clicks, and the clip was launched. He screamed as soon as he brought the phone to his face, staring at it in surprise and fear. The comments were pouring in. Everyone was discussing the young gaming genius. No one would leave him alone. Meanwhile, something caught Linar's attention, although he initially wanted to check the basement. Everything around was littered. More than 100 spectators were already watching him. Even a boy stopped and froze from this. They threw him donations. He stared at the next pop-up window. Missions had to be completed. I read this task carefully, lowering my weapon. The mission was to get to the basement as quickly as possible. A conversation with a friend on the floor came to mind. He warned that newcomers to the game should be afraid of one. This is exactly what Ben was talking about. There are people, trolls, who throw in missions, but they are becoming more and more difficult. Then the friend continued about the danger. The newcomer falls into a trap and does not always get out of it. Now, with his arms folded across his chest, Linar was thinking. It seemed to him that the task was easy, and he could handle it. With a smile on his lips, the man accepted the challenge. Everyone in the chat was alarmed, admiring his courage and recklessness. But he slowed down. He didn't think that they would turn off the chat for the duration of the mission. For the boy, it was a complete surprise. Linar made his way through the trash and scattered things, holding his pistol at the ready. Blood and corpses lay right on the floor. The former corpses of people now began to rise and slowly but surely reach out to our hero. And now it became clear to the boy why it was so difficult. I decided to finish quickly and fired into the air. The sound was very loud in that place. The zombies became alarmed and headed towards the man, opening their mouths in a silent scream. The gun now pointed at them. The bullet always hit the target accurately, as if the man were a true master in this matter. Without noticing how he began to glow yellow from his own shooting, the bullets hit the target accurately. Covered in blood, he leaned his back on the table and examined the work of his hands. He calmly shot at a zombie running towards him, and for this, he even received the highest rank for 10 hits. He sluggishly noticed that everything was very easy for him, and the people in the chat were going crazy about his speed and agility. I saw the glass shatter and police dogs rush into the room. This action was completely different from the previous one. The scary faces of dogs with sharp fangs, saliva and white eyes, they jumped straight towards the boy. Quickly leaving a trail, Linar ran away from them, jumping on chairs, rushing forward and further away from the monsters. Jumping high, he froze in the air and looked appraisingly at the approaching animals. The divine power shone through him again, and his hand stretched out as if by itself and pointed the gun. The dog flew away with a wild squeal, sticking out its long, forked tongue. The shot was so fast and accurate that people in the chat were even a little confused. They didn't notice this creature. He squatted down next to the animals, covered his eyes with his hand, was upset that he had come to kill. The guy did not notice the revived corpse behind him at all. He covered the dogs with a blanket, fired without looking, and hit the target. The audience roared. Having opened another door, I saw a cable, and the idea arose to get to the storage facility using it. He had almost started to go down it when he saw a flashlight on the floor. He would find it useful. Without even bending down, he picked up the flashlight with his foot. Everything fit into his hand. He looked back at something that caught his attention. I shone a flashlight and pointed the gun, but nothing appeared, even though I peered for a long time. Congratulations poured in. The man found a police storage facility, and now he saw the chat again. He pointed the flashlight at his face and laughed ominously, thanking everyone who was helping the newbie. A smile lit up Linar's face. He noted contentedly that he would be waiting for the next mission. He showed the card from the storage facility. It's worth checking and opening what's there. He looked conspiratorially. He beeped. The green light came on and the door opened. He scratched the back of his head, surprised by something. Linar's eyes widened. Everything in his body screamed about danger, as if red tentacles were reaching out to him. In the silence, a click came as a complete surprise. The door had locked, and no matter how hard I tried to shine a flashlight, I couldn't see anything. There was no point in making any sounds. The man turned around and saw a monster stretching out his skinless hands. A monster appeared before him, a swarm of zombies, its red eyes blazing, numerous naked human skulls sticking out of its voluminous body. The monster didn't see the hero, but reacted to the sound. People in the chat got alarmed. The boss always appears at the end of the game. Linar backed away from him quickly, thinking of how to attract the creature's attention. Holding the pass to the storage facility in his teeth, he decided to shoot and try. Everyone fell silent in anticipation. The sound attracted the monster's attention and pushed the boy away. He flew away, but did not drop the gun. He grabbed the weapon with both hands, his gaze fixed on the top, and fired straight at his target. The monster screamed. The iron that was on top fell on him. He was convinced that he was right, that he was reacting to sound. He was able to unlock the door and get inside. It was difficult, but the character managed it. There was a knock on the door, and the monster broke through a little. Linar recoiled, and was glad that the door was locked again. He looked around the room, shone the light on the place, and walked forward a little, surprised by the cleanliness and emptiness. He stopped, opened his mouth, and noticed that one cabinet was slightly open and he urgently needed to check what was there. I opened the locker and found a surprise for him. A weapon and a policeman's outfit that he could change into. They admired how the uniform suited him. Linar showed off in front of them, adjusting and brushing away invisible specks of dust. He looked at how many cartridges he had and smiled. He will wait for the next mission. And finally I waited, raised my eyes to the screen that appeared. The mission was received. Defeat the swarm of zombies without using firearms. I read the explanation about the task, and then suddenly turned around at the noise. Of course, the task was difficult. Before his eyes, the monster that needed to be destroyed crawled through the hole it had created. I looked at my belt. If a firearm is not allowed, then there is only one thing that can be used: a baton. He bit his fist. It would be very difficult to handle such a weapon, he chuckled. The monster was seeping through the hole, long tendrils of its arms reaching towards the boy. He struck with a club, decided to use Linar in close combat, and exhaled the name of the one who had given the mission. He threw the hero back with his large, skinless hand. The blow was strong, although he softened it by defending himself with a club. He recoiled. The monster began to fall, blow after blow. The fight continued, although the boy began to have fun. He looked back, smiled. Questions poured into the chat, but he only mysteriously thanked for the excellent mission. The chat turned off for the duration of the mission. The eyes lit up purple. The baton was ready. The boy accepted the mission without even knowing the conditions. Now he believed that it was enough to cut off the zombie's head. Lightning came out of his eyes. The problem was that there were several heads on the body, and it was impossible to tell where the main one was. The monster's teeth snapped almost next to the man's head, but he did not flinch, continuing to strike. The boy seemed like a small grain compared to the monster, but he deftly dodged the capture. Linar tried to find the right head, striking, jumping back and approaching him again. The gaze caught on something. Among the upper faces there is only one main one, the hero decided. And he found it, saw it with his divine vision, swung it. The club lit up with light, into that very needed face. The man jumped back, clutching a club in his hand, already covered in slime, and watched as the monster sank, and the faces flowed off the body. Mission accomplished. As the monster's heads flowed, the man leaned to the side and examined his weapon. He exhaled as he looked down at his hand, and noticed that it was half covered in the slime that had flowed out of the monster. He covered his eyes with his hand, upset about his new clothes, but a blue sign lit up, notifying him of the completion of the mission. The questions in the chat were pouring out and people were jubilant and surprised. Without taking their hand away from their eyes, they glanced sideways at the blue sign. He laughed, waved his hand, squinted his eyes with laughter, thanked them, because with them the stream becomes more interesting. Linar went further to find out what was there. Money was pouring in from people. He liked it. I found a ladder, was surprised and walked towards it, resolutely going down. What he saw made him gasp. There was smoke and destroyed columns all around. The roof of the building was covered with rubbish. After finishing the game, Ben couldn't contain his emotions and shouted in his friend's face. The young man poked at the laptop and showed his friend's level, indignantly shouting about the work he had done. He was holding a phone in his hands. That was the most interesting thing. Linar stretched his head out with interest, looking at it. Wiping away the tears that were flowing from Ben's eyes, the boy held the phone in his hands, which was acknowledged by the game developers. The boy now needed a decent nickname, and his friend helped, developed several, and settled on one. He leaned forward. The hero agreed with this. A satisfied smile appeared on his lips. They would take him. The fair-haired boy was immersed in the game again, a smile flickering on his lips. Embarrassed, he scratched the back of his head, stood up and greeted, introducing himself by his new nickname, Pearl. He justified himself to people in the chat. The conversation flowed easily and cheerfully, and they spoke of him with admiration. He closed his eyes and folded his arms across his chest, teasingly saying that yesterday he had no name, but today he had an official greeting. He raised his hand and greeted, smiled. Now his name in the game is Pearl. He spread his arms and explained that the name of the game contained the meaning of perfection, so they should not make mistakes. He threw his hands up and smiled widely. Now he was ready to start again. In 10 seconds the game would load. I dived in, stretched, and didn't immediately notice that the street felt different somehow. Not noticing the danger behind him, he calmly went about his business, while the zombie was already stretching out his hands. The character didn't lose his composure, and deftly threw the zombie man over himself, quickly and briskly. He pressed his foot against his shoulder, pointed the gun at him and pulled the trigger. The first one was killed. While holding the zombie in this position, someone called out and shouted affirmatively that he was not a zombie. He glanced sideways and saw a figure with a pistol in his hands, which was pointed at him. The girl held the boy at gunpoint, her hair pulled back into a ponytail that fluttered in the wind. She was told that the entire local police force was dead, and without lowering their weapons, she asked the hero's name. Everything would have been friendly if it weren't for the pistols in their hands. They introduced themselves to each other. After Sandra asked about the condition, he raised his hands up, and a smile lit up his face, and suggested that she check it herself. Finally, the girl lowered the gun, and even a barely noticeable smile touched her lips. She told me that there was a camp with survivors, and the boy's strength could be useful to them. She easily extended her hand to the hero, offered to join them. People in the chat were amazed that their favorite opened up so easily. He smiled. He didn't really have a choice, but he accepted the offer and said yes. Pearl had nowhere else to go, so he selected the yes answer on the board, reached out and pressed it. Coming closer, Sandra was glad about the guy's decision. Every person is important to them. The girl turned around sharply, exhaled in fear, heard this sound, perked up. They are coming back. People in yellow protective suits descended from the combat vehicle, surveyed the surrounding area and looked for survivors. The man cursed and stepped on another corpse under his feet. He didn't like this place. He needed to find the living and take a test. The young people hid behind the car. Sandra breathed a sigh of relief. They almost got caught. The woman explained, drawing attention to the patch, the emblem that was on the sleeve of those people's jackets. They discussed what and who these people were. Slowly got up and looked around so as not to fall into their hands. Sandra wondered why these people came to this particular place. Pearl listened carefully, hiding behind the car. They headed to the next block. The girl spoke up. She suggested that they urgently go to the camp and warn the others. As soon as they got to the camp, all the people ran up to Sandra. Old people and children, men and women. Everyone was worried and asking about her. They also noticed a young man nearby. People were surprised. No one thought that there were still police officers. Sandra interrupted the flow of questions and asked about Logan. The boy stood nearby and kept a modest silence. Already in the room where the man was, a girl entered and almost fell into the arms of an adult policeman. He patted the girl on the shoulder with a smile and assured her that everything was fine and there was no need to worry. But before moving on to discussing business, the girl decided to introduce Pearl and extended her hand in his direction. Not noticing anything strange, she continued speaking as if nothing had happened, correcting the man that the police had not disappeared. Logan's smile became too forced, and he also patted the guy on the shoulder. The hero remained serious and did not show a smile when the man leaned over slightly and whispered to him that he had already seen somewhere. He glanced at his hand, where an aura was already blackening, cursed to himself, and didn't admit it openly. Pearl's gaze became wild. He suspected that the officer standing in front of him was not really him. The hand wouldn't go away. Logan was asking for trouble himself, even though the character didn't want to interfere, but he still chose to take action. Pearl leaned closer to the officer, chuckled thoughtfully and raised his hand to his face. Something was wrong. What worried him most was that he straightened up and pointed to his chest, to his badge and distinctions. He came closer to him, laughed. Did not look like his badge. The hero chose to reveal the truth. He reached into the inside pocket of his shirt and told Sandra that it would be better for her to see it for herself than to take my word for it. He handed over a paper. It said that Logan was wanted by the police and had been convicted 8 times. The girl's eyes widened. She squeezed the sheet of paper. She didn't believe that there could be such a bastard among them. The man was sweating, trying to justify himself. While the girl was reading the sheet, Logan was slowly moving backwards towards the table, feeling for the weapon with his hand. But the main character turned out to be quicker, pointed a gun at his throat from behind his back, and prevented him from performing the action. Sandra couldn't stand the deception. She jumped up sharply and struck Logan in the chest. He was strong. He recoiled. His mouth opened in a scream. The air rushed out of his lungs, and Pearl grinned as he watched. The girl dealt him blow after blow, beating him while telling him off with everything that had accumulated. One last blow and Logan flew back, hitting the floor, throwing the door open. Sandra didn't stop, and even after that, she slowly approached, carrying the darkness behind her. She wanted to put a noose on his head. Without control, she began methodically beating the man again, noticing everything that had happened in the past, his shifty eyes and cowardly attitude. The tied-up Logan was dragged along in a wheelbarrow by a girl. He deceived them for a long time, built his kingdom. In the end, the man was unable to hide everything and was subjected to public execution. The people who were in the camp were angry. They were ready to kill the scoundrel because he was to blame for their isolation. Sandra, hearing the support of her friends, let go of the rope that held the chair and was already beginning to fall down from the roof. Covered in blood and wounds, Logan clenched his teeth to keep a scream from escaping his chest, but wild horror splashed in his eyes. Waving goodbye, the girl revealed that he was now dog food. The man fell from the roof straight into the mouths of the hungry zombies that swarmed below. When it got dark, Pearl glanced out the window, waiting to see what would happen next. Unable to bear it, he asked Sandra what her future plans were, and the girl, without raising her head, asked about him. Her face darkened. Her compressed lips spoke of tension. She didn't know what to do next. Then on the roof, people were shouting, interrupting each other. The food would soon run out, and a woman also confirmed that it was not worth staying there. She put her head on the table, lamenting her mistake. Before that, they had been waiting for help from the police. He pushed himself away from the glass, understanding that Sandra was an important game character, and now he should be gentler with her. He leaned towards the girl, calming and supporting her. Words about help burst out by themselves. She coughed sheepishly, turned her face away and thanked him. They had to decide where to go. I quickly got ready and decided that it was worth asking the military for help. I turned to him. After the zombie outbreak, there is only one safe zone. Since there is no connection, it means we should go ourselves. He showed the place where the tunnel was on the map and suggested going there. The woman looked at him appraisingly, smarter than she seemed. Giving in to a moment of weakness, Sandra pressed herself against Pearl and sincerely thanked him for his care and help. He closed his eyes, hugged her, whispered her name, and the girl pressed herself closer to him. And then he pushed away from her as soon as he heard about the feelings that he hoped were mutual. She moved closer to him, did not react to attempts to stop, pressed herself once again and touched his lips. Sandra's cheeks turned red, but the boy didn't expect this, and a drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. He couldn't even move. Apparently that was how the game was supposed to be. Purr raised his crazy gaze. He even found it a little funny. The man got up naked in bed, covered only by a sheet, and was glad that everything was happening during an eclipse. Sandra sat in her shirt and sipped coffee, saluted him with her mug, and complimented him on his sleep. As she was leaving the room, she reminded him about the meeting and the next meeting in the hall. Lying on the bed, already fully dressed, the man talked to a chat of people, arms folded on his chest, but everything was calm. He was even thinking about another hunt when there was a knock on the door. The door to the room opened slightly and a small boy looked in, timidly and uncertainly. Pearl stood up abruptly. The boy walked forward and asked about his affairs. Looking at him with huge blue eyes, he extended his fist and persistently offered to open it. A small yellow ball fell into the young man's outstretched palm and brought him something. The boy noted with weight that the thing he found was worth taking to the police and praised it. He held it up, examined the thing. It was a coin, stroked the boy on the head. Ben jumped up as soon as he heard about the slot machine, nervously biting his finger. The random box machine appears early on. The game is difficult, so the chances of winning are terrible. Many streamers manage to get several thousand views from this, freaking out and getting nervous. He folded his arms across his chest and pronounced the verdict on the waste of time, leaning back in his chair. But there was still hope that if Linar played, there would be a win. The young man smiled joyfully and squeezed the coin in his fingers. He waved his hand, determined, and considered the golden shotgun to be the best weapon. He stopped in front of the machine gun and raised his hand to his lips. He liked the good name of the weapon. I read what was happening in the chat. People were advising him on how to play, but the guy was confident in himself. Having inserted the coin, now it was necessary to pull the lever and the boxes would open. It was worth pressing. He reached out to the lever and pulled it. The smile did not leave his face. Suddenly the smile disappeared from his lips, leaving only surprise and confusion about what was happening. In his hand he held the very lever that needed to be turned, but something was happening. A strange sensation took over him completely. The blue color swirled around. It was as if the young man had become more sensitive. He even pressed his fingers to his lips. His feelings were changing like a kaleidoscope. I realized that it was related to the machine. I was cranking it for too long and didn't try to stop it. I decided to stop at the most pleasant feeling. The crazy eyes lit up with light. The box stopped, and Pearl was holding some object in her hands, and people in the chat were screaming in admiration. The character received a legendary shotgun, twirled it in his hand, even better than he imagined. I threw it over my shoulder. It was time to go to the subway and have some fun. But Sandra's figure appeared. Their figures moved further and further into the metro. The man and woman set off on a mission. As they set out on their journey together, they encountered several monsters that had no heads, but only inward-facing teeth. Sandra, her dagger flashing, deftly fought the huge spider. The healthy limb knocked the weapon out of the girl's hands and she recoiled. Pearl immediately ran up, cutting down the monsters he met along the way. Now he no longer attacked the large spider, delivering precise blows with his weapon. This time they didn't need the golden shotgun, because when the character fell to the ground, he fired his pistol. With Sandra's support, everything was too easy, the guy admitted. The task was completed. The arachne was defeated. The players stopped near it and examined it. Walking further, Pearl stopped and stared at the very place where he needed to go. In front of them was a pile of littered garbage, and further away they could see the house where the safe zone was located. I stopped and the guy asked a completely correct question about the military guarding this place. It turned out that the same people in protective yellow suits were circling around the building. Ben experienced too many emotions, screaming and thus frightening Linar, demanding to pour it out right now. He didn't even bring the straw with the drink he was holding to his mouth, and was surprised by the speed of his friend's work. He confirmed that yes, the situation requires it, even though he was the first to find the secret path. But someone else could have posted the video. He looked up, scratched his cheek. Now it was clear to him that Ben was sitting there satisfied. Again, the young man seemed amazed when his friend suggested opening a channel for him. As he became immersed in the game, the young man heard and saw messages of praise, and people threw money at him. I thanked them all. I had no idea that this was possible, and was sincerely happy with the number of subscribers. He had something interesting for them. He extended his hand with a smile on his face. He turned on the chatbot, spread his arms wide, and admitted that freedom of speech is good, but being careful doesn't hurt. According to the rules, 3 complaints and you're banned. He swung the illusory bat and laughed loudly. After this announcement, he announced that it was time to start, and disappeared into blue. People in yellow protective suits were examining all sides around the building. The guy realized that this organization was deceiving the government, and he needed to find another way to get inside. The girl looked out from behind cover. Apparently there was no other way. She needed to understand what was happening. Pearl was about to pass by them. Sandra clarified that the guns didn't work there. She prepared sharp daggers and almost rushed into battle. The chat buzzed with delight. But a bait was thrown ahead of them. The people in yellow saw it and became interested in this object. They warned that the territory was under the jurisdiction of the 5th Detachment. Unauthorized entry was prohibited. Sandra, her yellow eyes flashing, rushed into the attack before the guys even finished their speech. The girl put 2 of them against the wall, difficulties one after another. Now it's time to attack further. In front, the woman saw 3 more men in yellow who were waiting to meet her. He wanted to warn the others about the danger of an attack. He already raised the radio to his mouth, even said a few words, but he didn't have time. As soon as he came under attack, the men scattered. One held on and grabbed his eyes. Pearl flew up and hit the man who was trying to shoot. He waved his hand and the dagger flashed in his hands. He shouted and cursed against the weapon. He suddenly glanced sideways, felt a gun pointed behind him, and froze for a couple of seconds. He suddenly shot up, and now the man was lying on his back with a knife stuck in his forehead, and he hit another man with a swing of his elbow. Pearl deftly killed enemies. But Sandra's help was also pleasant. He turned his head, and a smile immediately flashed on his lips. The girl was embarrassed. Behind her, defeated people in yellow suits were kneeling. After the victory, we simply left this place together and moved on. The buzzing attracted the attention of the heroes. It was a drone flying and filming them, everything they did. Sandra stopped the guy with her hand, opened her mouth and showed Pearl this equipment. A mechanical voice asked about the district police, and the young people stopped. The guy decided it would be better to pretend to be a policeman now, so he held out his hand and asked what was going on. Pearl told him that there were still survivors in the city, which is why a rescue operation was being carried out, but the infected zone was not under their influence. Sandra couldn't stand it and rushed forward, shouting the whole truth about the kidnapping and the experiments. But the drone argued with the people again, saying that the military was doing everything possible. The girl stopped and spoke angrily again about the experiments. The guy was surprised when he heard about the vaccine, but Sandra thought it was a lie. When the drone asked for evidence, the young people looked downcast. They had none. She looked at the guy. The girl whispered, "If they leave, they will die. Proof was required. Then the military will take action." So they stood and watched as the drone left the territory. No one here would help them. In the end, they returned empty-handed. Sandra raised her hand and touched her forehead. She didn't know what to do. The hero put his arm around her shoulders, calmed her down, did everything in her power, looked at him carefully. Her cheeks turned red. She touched them with her hands and immediately remembered about the others. She should hurry. When they got to their camp, the silence was deafening. The girl called Bill and Lloyd, but there was no answer. Her face darkened and her eyes widened when she saw an important object on the floor. She fell to the floor and screamed loudly next to the boy's bear. Pearl sat down next to her. Tears rolled down the girl's cheeks, hugging and swaying from side to side. She screamed and called the boys. The hero raised his head, peered into something. His eyes lit up yellow. He didn't like the aura. The monster pushed forward, sarcasm lacing his words about the gift he had prepared for them. It was Logan, but now he was transformed. His head was small in relation to his body. His eyes were glowing red. The girl screamed, recognizing this monster, who had recently been her friend, and opened her mouth in a scream. The fusion of the giant and Logan gave birth to a new Logan, who told in detail how he killed the guys, spreading his arms out to the sides as if he was proud of it. The character's hand began to tremble. He could barely contain his rage. The divine power was trying to break free. "Even though it's a game, this monster has crossed all boundaries," the guy said with flashing eyes. He held the girl by the hand. Anger engulfed these two. Their faces darkened. Monster Logan wanted one thing: to destroy, to make the little bugs writhe in pain. Suddenly the ceiling collapsed, and the heroes were scattered to the sides. Pearl remained on one side with the monster, standing right in front of him. I looked up. They say that the boss is the scariest, but it wasn't so. A new mission appeared before the man, to kill Logan by any means necessary, and the bonuses poured in, the stakes increased, and they offered more and more for the mission. Too hard, he looked up and thanked his people for their support. He sincerely admitted that he had long wanted to give this bastard a beating. He corrected himself. This monster should have gotten what he deserved long ago. Sandra fell to the floor, looked around. The wall collapsed, protecting her and Pearl. She pressed herself against the hole that had formed in the stone. A drop of sweat ran down her cheek, and saw the monster regenerate. Logan smugly boasted about his new beautiful form. He liked everything about himself. He turned to her and warned her that her turn would come too, and that he would leave some for dessert. Pearl realized that the weapon really wasn't working, so he took out both the dagger and the shotgun. The guy was resolutely preparing for battle. His actions would be the answer. The monster was gaining power. There was no need to make mistakes. The guy went head-on, dodging blows. With a knife, he cut his muscles, tendons, a weak spot. A man rushed forward lightning fast, cutting off his legs. I stopped and noticed that the bleeding stopped faster, but it still took more time for a full recovery. He pointed a shotgun at the monster and offered to test it by shooting how long it could hold out. Still, Logan is a human fusion, and cutting the tendon area was a great idea. I waited for further action, looked appraisingly. The monster's leg was covered with a green glow. It was recovering with difficulty. A smile of madness touched Pearl's lips. As he thought, the bullet that hit the tendons was preventing them from growing together. The monster ran towards him, waving his huge fists. It couldn't end like this. The real fight was just beginning. He swung at the boy, who dodged, his mouth open. The battle wasn't exactly easy for him. He struck his blow, hitting the monster Logan again, his eyes flashing, and the fight was brutal. Everything was sparkling with light. People were raging in the chat and didn't understand what was happening. The hero dodged, struck blows, and so on in a circle. No one was inferior in strength. Logan's fist was already raised over the guy, but he seemed not to notice the threat and dodged the blow. The monster fell to its knees and roared, its entire body sparkling as if it was disintegrating. I pointed my shotgun at a zombie. I wanted to check if a zombie could die from blood loss. Spreading his arms on the floor, he asked himself why he couldn't recover and hung his head in resignation. But then he roared that everything couldn't end like this, and attacked the character, considering him guilty of everything. If it weren't for the monster roaring, the guy would have fallen to the floor and crawled a little further. Scattering stones in his hands, as if this zombie had gained strength, he growled and flashed his teeth. He raised his hands, the baton appeared in the man's hands, and his eyes flashed at the blow he delivered. I calculated the steps and blows with my vision. It was time for a critical strike. Holding the shotgun tightly in his hand, he headed towards the monster, jumping on the stones that were flying from the zombie. He stopped carefully on a stone, almost colliding, maintaining his balance. He had a plan in his head. He swung the club in his hand. Now is the very moment that everyone is waiting for. The creature screamed, hit him right in the eye. His mouth opened and an inhuman scream came out. Pearl towered over him, a club stuck in his mouth, and his opponent was disconcerted. And the boy decided to finish him off, took aim and shot at him, as if he had forgotten what he had to do. It fell apart, creating a hole through which the guy was visible, and zombie parts were flying to the sides. He landed on the floor, put the shotgun on his shoulder, grinned. The task was very easy. In the end, he came to a conclusion. He thanked them for their trust. His smile grew wider, and he clowned around in front of those watching him. I turned my attention with fear to the ceiling. It began to fall. I was confused at first. But then he pulled himself together and ran to Sandra, shouting her name, fear still on his face. He stopped when he saw a girl who was sitting hugging a teddy bear, and had no intention of saving herself. He grabbed her and suddenly fell to the side with her, rolling to a safe place. Having caught their breath, they saw that the place where they had been was now buried under a pile of stones. Pearl exhaled happily, while Sandra glanced sideways at his wound, which was now glowing green. Feeling a threat behind the warehouse, he didn't pay attention to the girl, instantly becoming serious. Taking advantage of this pause, she brought his hand closer to herself, causing the boy to scream. She brushed him off sharply, pushed the man's hand away, and sternly asked who he was. Raising his hand, he himself was surprised by such a color. He did not understand what was happening to him. Meanwhile, the hand was becoming increasingly green, and it was now glowing more and more. Sandra screamed, not holding back her emotions, reminding him that Logan was like that too, and that the man would also become a monster. Her face darkened. She fell silent abruptly, and asked again in a resigned tone, as if accusing him of this. The guy looked, his mouth dropped open. He himself didn't understand that the game could go according to a different plot. Pearl now had two glowing hands. Sandra looked at him with her arms spread out to the sides, asking if he was human. Shaking his head, he began to doubt his own humanity and was surprised by the situation. The man admitted to the audience that he had not expected this. But maybe he was not a human, he noted cheerfully. Sandra pointed a gun at him and ordered him to explain himself right now, giving him a chance. The girl waited for an answer. The sign flashed with an offer to convince of her humanity. He grinned, opened his mouth. The chat was buzzing. They didn't understand how to convince her of this at all, and this made it even more interesting. He bowed his head, scratched it, frankly admitted that he would now tell her everything he knew, and repented to her. He took a step and at the same time spoke, charmed Sandra. Without any lies he would reveal himself. He doesn't know who he is. The woman cursed, not believing it one bit, but continued to persuade Pearl. The only thing he was sure of. He fell silent. He leaned his head against the gun and grabbed it with his hands, holding it, and admitted that his feelings for her were sincere. If he didn't believe her, he could shoot. So they stood. The girl stepped back a little, but the gun was still touching the boy. The rain seemed to sense the state of their souls. She lowered her weapon, drooped, and began to apologize. The woman was confused. Tears started to flow from his eyes. He put his arm around the girl's neck, and Pearl buried his head in her forehead. He asked her to trust him just once. Sandra's mouth opened slightly. She thought about the words. He successfully convinced Sandra. She buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking from sobs. Holding the girl with his hand, stroking and calming her, signs with the next choice appeared in front of the hero. The choice was made, but the mistrust between the couple would not disappear so quickly. They sat together on the stones, and in order to continue the journey together, they had to overcome this. There was no other way out. The mistrust became even greater because of one thing when they went on motorcycles, wanting to survive in this reality. The motorcycles left dust behind them. The goal was to liquidate the corporation. The man chose this point. Sandra straightened up and repeated that this group has ears and eyes everywhere. It will be difficult. The entrance to the building was well guarded. I sat on the roof examining the paths, lamenting if they had even one. He sat down and turned to Sandra, but she interrupted him and drew attention to the radio from which the voice was coming. He brought it to his mouth and asked who it was, while looking at the entrance to the building they wanted to get into. Sobbing and wailing came from the radio, but he interrupted and sternly asked Pearl to answer the question. The answer came. The young people looked at each other in shock. Jessica, a researcher at the Penta organization. They asked again in surprise, looked at the radio in their hands with apprehension, but, getting ahead of their fear, asked for time to explain. The girl admitted that she wanted to reveal them, and they sat back down on the edge of the roof from such a statement. The character asked again as if he hadn't heard, but Jessica replied that she was collecting evidence of wrongdoing. Even though she knew about the police, she believed that they would answer her. She was collecting data and needed help. We looked at the building right away. The girl needed help in transmitting data, but she couldn't do it alone. Too many guards. The boy looked down. It won't be that easy to get through. But the girl did not retreat and opened the passage. The building is connected by sewerage. There will be no one there except special personnel. I was thinking about whether to follow or not, and a board appeared to make a choice. On this note, he finished the game, spread his arms and smiled. There were a lot of events. He shared his impressions. He narrowed his eyes and reminded that the voting would take place on his page. He saluted with his hand and said goodbye to his spectators, still sitting on the stone roof. A man dressed as a cat greeted his kittens and complained about the heat outside, propping his cheek with his hand. The main gaming streamer threw up his hands as soon as he saw the video that was posted, screaming. I looked closely at Sandra. Didn't recognize this girl. My eyes opened in surprise. He jumped up from his seat. The mask flew off. Only his ears remained, shouting what it was. He sat down again, watched with dismay, and said that the newcomer had the best result of all time. He responded with admiration, jumping up from his seat once more, which caused such a reaction. Video to preview. He returned to his place, exhaled and folded his arms across his chest, noting with displeasure that the newcomer would become easy prey for cyber-saboteurs. Linar grumbled with displeasure at the sight of his friend, and put his hands in the pockets of his sweatpants. Ben was sprawled on the table, his glasses lay nearby, and it seemed he had no strength to talk. But just as the man was about to drink the drink, his friend jumped up and shoved a tablet under his nose. He looked at the laptop screen in surprise. Ben adjusted his glasses and explained that they were being hunted. Cyber pests. They quickly spread information on the network, discussing everyone and everything. He screamed. They didn't give permission for this. After the guy's words in response to the complaint, he grimaced. He was counting on this. Linar touched his hand to his mouth and listened attentively to Ben as he talked about game developers. He suggested not to get depressed because of this, stroked her soothingly, and tried to justify himself. The two of them must stand together as captains of one ship, moving forward towards the intended goal. Linar, drooping his glass, didn't understand why his friend was speaking in riddles, and he had to fish for information. He showed the news that deserved attention, even took his hand away from his face and became interested. This was the first time this had happened, but the proposal came from the official developers of the biocrime game. Pearl greeted his viewers as soon as he entered the game, smiling his signature smile again. He rose from his chair, walked around the white room, put his hand behind his back, and waved the other to his pearls. Becoming serious, he had very important news for them, and asked them to pay more attention. He sat down and pointed somewhere above his head, adding an advertisement, the sponsor of his performance. Money started pouring in, people started sending money. A smile appeared on the man's lips. He thanked him. He put his hand to his chest, and thanked them for their interest in him and in the game. But before they start the game, the young man must also explain himself, folding his hands on his knees. A few days ago at the Gup Company Cafe, Linar glanced at Ben, who was very nervous. The girl put forward her demands and requests, gesticulated with her hands, but held herself with dignity. Ben read the blue sign with delight, admitting that it was a brilliant move, and that everyone was benefiting. A smile appeared on the girl's lips, another demand for the disclosure of Easter eggs in the game, an explanation of them. I tried to explain, swiped on the blue screen. The game is different from the developers' plans. She gave the example of the giant Logan. He shouldn't have died, and gave many arguments for this. Some bosses are not worth destroying. You can dodge the attack and escape with help. It is almost impossible to kill them. But Ben corrected that Linar succeeded. The guy modestly remained silent. The girl coughed into her fist and asked to reveal these routes so that there would be no misunderstanding. Now the hero was telling that going through hidden routes was not the only possible path. He scratched his head and told his viewers that he had significantly shortened the game thanks to his walkthroughs. He spread his arms, smiled, and shared that they should play the way they want. That's the whole secret. People, of course, didn't believe it. They thought that saying it was easy to beat the game was just a lie. The man thought, raised his hand to his chin, and said something else. The men looked at each other. Even then, the decision was entirely Linar's. The conditions were tempting. The guy looked up. There was nothing in this that was worth thinking about for too long. The girl smiled sincerely. If there were any problems with this, Linar would have noticed. And yet something stopped him from signing the contract. He himself did not understand what was oppressing the guy. Raising his head, a serious look, he asked for one condition. The woman began to say that they could come to an agreement, but he interrupted. As a result, everyone came to a common agreement. He folded his hands on his knees, and a smile shone on his face. He thanked. He admitted, closing his eyes, that he does not allow his video to be used in any other videos. He also warned players that the use of his video materials would be subject to fines. At this point, the introduction was complete. The guy began to dissolve in the game. It was time to dive into it. And then the policeman appeared again. The results of the voting that had been launched last time were interesting. Excellent offer. They will be able to get evidence. Turning to the girl, he waited for her to act. But Sandra doubted that it was a mistake, since Jessica was a researcher at this company. Pearl argued. He didn't believe it either, but it was worth taking advantage of such a chance, and the girl seemed to be listening, but she remained firm. The boy raised his hand and made a compelling argument that perhaps his body had something to do with them. Sandra smiled. She completely trusts Pearl. That's why she'll go for this. We looked around the sewers. The stench was incredible. Waste was floating nearby. But there was a mission and we had to follow it. He coughed into Pearl's hand and admitted that he became more tolerant the longer he stayed here. Having removed my hand completely, I realized that the smell had completely gone. But the audience did not believe it and considered it a lie. The girl pressed herself against the guy's back, her pistol already prepared for defense. Pearl stopped her with a wave of her hand, asked her not to make noise. He assessed the situation himself, heard the sound of someone there. Lightning flashed across his ears. The young man heard only the echo. He listened carefully to the sound. They ran quickly. Something was moving towards them and they didn't wait. They started running. Pearl looked back and saw a huge creature with glowing red eyes rushing towards them. A huge rat was rushing after them. Its claws were large, and its body itself consisted of small mice. The hero stopped, turned around and fired his pistol, slowing down in anticipation. The young man's eyes sparkled. He looked closely, but did not understand what was happening with the difficulty in this game. They stopped. They were gradually surrounded by rats. Although they killed the main big one, the rest were thirsty for their blood. A notification came that it was not necessary to kill, but simply to slip through. and they began to whisper indignantly in the chat that this was really possible. Pearl put out his weapon and laughed. If they wanted him to run away, they should have made the enemies stronger. Thanks to his heightened senses, the boy could feel a nauseating smell, fast running and red eyes. Pearl's eyes sparkled, the shooting began, and the chat realized that he was not just a person. They stopped together with Sandra and looked at the work of their hands. What surrounded them turned to dust. But that was not the end. In addition to the 5 senses, there is a 6th one that scans everything around, the man admitted, and his eyes flashed. He repelled attacks from the right and left, deftly wielding the dagger that the guy had in his hand. The man rushed by so quickly that the pieces of the rats' bodies had not yet had time to fall to the ground. But he froze. Something was wrong. He couldn't understand what exactly, these creatures they were. He froze without saying any more words. They simply chose another target, surrounding the retreating Sandra, even though she had a pistol in her hands. Pearl, seeing this, instantly became serious and hurried to the girl's rescue, destroying rats along the way. A scream of horror rang out loudly. It was Sandra screaming in the circle of terrible rats that opened their mouths and attacked her. The monsters enveloped her, only her eyes remained intact, in which fear and horror splashed. In the original version of the game, the woman dies. With his yellow eyes flashing, the man couldn't leave it like that, and went on the attack to protect the girl. Sandra screamed. The gun was nearby, driving the bloodthirsty monsters away from her. All weapons were used, both pistol and dagger, cutting through the air, driving away and destroying the rats. The girl survived. The audience experienced real fear for her. Everything could have been like in the original version. But still a sign appeared, notifying that Sandra was infected. He cried out and looked at his friend in surprise. The girl's whole body trembled. She raised her hand. There was a scratch. Her voice stuttered. She didn't understand when she could have been injured. He grabbed Pearl by the hands, realizing that whatever happened, either the death of the character or infection, it was inevitable. The man smiled. The organization should help them. They will work together. Doubts were reflected on his face. He asked himself a question, which surprised the woman even more, who was looking at him with wide eyes. He flashed his blade and said that although the stream was sponsored, he would play the game the way he wanted. Their path continued, climbing up the stairs first, Sandra joking about her situation. The situation eased a bit, and the guy was worried as he climbed in after her. As he climbed the ladder, the man reassured them that since there was no signal, everything was fine. He froze and a drop of sweat ran down his cheek when he heard some kind of fuss where Sandra had ended up. He quickly stood up and was already pushing off to rush into the attack, when he stopped in amazement. I was a little confused by what I saw. I didn't even get up. I was still in the same pose as I was. Sandra held the girl at gunpoint, screaming and begging about this place. The hero straightened up, didn't even know what to do, whether he should intervene, put his hands on his hips, and watched. And the girl continued to find out what and how. The sobbing woman spoke about experiments. Jessica, and it was she, apologized and justified herself to her through tears, apparently blaming the improper disposal of waste. Sandra stepped back, lowering the gun, deciding that she couldn't cause any harm. Rubbing her cheek, the girl turned around. Huge glasses covered her face. Her greenish hair was long. She was shaking. The guy's eyes flashed and he noticed that the audience liked Jessica, but the place was terrible. The girls stood on different sides. Neither of them liked the place. Even the location with Logan was better. It's probably because they destroy people like them here, the girl called out, drawing attention to herself. Jessie laughed. She wanted to introduce herself, but Sandra rudely interrupted her. The situation is urgent. She handed over a flash drive with all the data about the illegal experiments and a plan of the building. You need to take this to the director's office on the top floor. That's the only way to contact anyone outside. Sandra reasonably noted that it was difficult to give her this flash drive personally, and she stared in anticipation. Upset at being interrupted, she clenched her fists and began to tremble, trying to explain. I tried to tell her about the security. The girl could turn off the cameras for a while. She would give a signal on the radio, and she began to explain what needed to be done and how to get there. But the hero called her, interrupting, wanting to say his piece. He swung the blade. Pearl attracted Jessica's attention. She screamed and thought fearfully of something terrible. He showed her his hand, which was glowing at the sight of the wound, and she even ran up to him, surprised by this. She screamed because she saw the glow for the first time and began to guess and build theories about how it came about. Questions poured out and the employee did not close her mouth, even touching the man's hand due to an excess of emotions. Sandra couldn't stand such rude behavior and jumped up, demanding that he remove his hands. She waved her hand, pushing the girl away. She got carried away, confessed and tried to come to her senses. She turned back to the man and demanded that he answer her questions about the vague memory and the sensations. She jerked away from him, raised her hands, got carried away and apologized for her behavior. She lowered her head already at a distance, when the boy began asking his questions about himself. Jessica then admitted that Pearl was an experiment, a successful one. They applied an elixir to him that strengthens the body. She spread her arms out to the sides and spoke enthusiastically about the work done. An ideal tool for an ideal person. Then she looked at him carefully, and clarified more for herself that the elixir had been used on him. Pearl got wet and cried out, surprised by this turn of events. For him it was a complete surprise. She folded her hands, her hair flew up, she was happy. This changed everything. She pulled him by the hand, dragged him along. They urgently need to conduct some tests. Everything can be improved and corrected. The eyes lit up with madness. It would be possible to end the crisis right now. Sandra pushed him away, shielded the man with her body. She wouldn't let him go anywhere. Jessica's reaction was frightening. She glanced sideways and asked the hero not to contact her. Their task of transmitting data reminded him. She screamed, calling Sandra an idiot. Everything should end as soon as the vaccine is ready. Pearl trembled, feeling with his whole skin something terrible approaching them. The siren also started to howl, he started to sweat, and a bad feeling came over the guy. What was happening? No one knew. But a monster appeared, gathering strength to attack. A prisoner who had been experimented on escaped, all in chains, muscles bulging on his skin. Pearl admitted that Overlord looks great, but he didn't recognize the game character. The guy got a hidden quest to defeat the monster in front of them. The chat started buzzing, encouraging and supporting the participant. Understanding pierced the young man. He realized who was in front of him, and his mouth opened wide in surprise. The reward for this quest was revealed. There will be a hidden ending, the guy read. Jessica couldn't take it anymore and buried her face in the man's chest, crying in fear, and clutching his clothes tightly. She looked up at him and begged him to run away from here with the vaccine and not to file a report. Sandra did not hold back her sarcasm, because the escaped prisoner ended up here. She did not consider it a coincidence. The boy had two options, but they had already done a lot, he thought with a smile. Pushing Jessica away from him, he looked at Sandra and suggested using the secret passage and finding themselves safe. The girl screamed, not agreeing with this. She couldn't leave the guy to deal with this alone. He asked to touch and accept his care. This would be the best option. She remembered her wound, looked at it sadly. The girl doubted, Pearl reassured. In the end, she agreed and rushed with the research assistant, asking him to win on the go, because they would be waiting for him. The man smiled over his shoulder. Everything will be done, and waved his hand. He prepared for battle, his eyes sparkling with light, a pistol in one hand, a blade in the other. Before the capsules appeared, the game had a boss character, Overlord. He is the main villain who, according to the plot of the story, opposes the main character and is also the king of zombies. Throughout the game, he appears in different variations and has earned recognition from players. And now this character rushed at our hero, completely upgrading his image. His strength becomes greater, and he cannot be defeated with pistols alone, appearing before Pearl in all his glory. I tried to shoot, pointed the gun at him. Everyone hoped for victory, but the bullet bounced off, even if aimed at the head, as if it were a wall without causing any harm. Even his head regenerates. Despite the fact that he is a zombie, he turned and struck towards the guy. While the hero was trying to figure out how to win and find his zone, he shot back and dodged. There was no other option. A smile appeared on his lips. He saw that Overlord understood the trajectory of the bullet and dodged it. It would be difficult to defeat him. They played tag, dodging, and the elusive guy calculated his options. Shots were heard periodically, bullets reached their target, but it was all useless. As the spectators jumped back and reloaded the pistol, they noticed for the first time that Pearl was having difficulty. I just need to see those very places. I already found them. But the problem was that they were hidden under the belts. The straps are on the chest, in the very middle, and you can only deal with them with the help of a certain object that the guy didn't have. The Overlord jumped up and reached out his hand towards the boy in an attempt to grab hold of him. Not a perfect attack. Pearl jumped up again, pushing off from the stone, flew up and decisively attacked the monster. Eyes flashed. It's worth trying to figure out the belt first, which caused dissonance in the chat. The boy kept joking during the flight. Even when a fist was flying at him, he kept smiling. On the shoulder, divine vision showed where it was necessary to remove it, and then it would be a way out for the boy. He opened fire on him. The guy was flying and shooting. Without looking away, determination on his face. The bullets reached their target. A bright flash illuminated the monster's shoulder, and I was finally able to remove the plaque. The straps fell off and exposed that very necessary place, right in the middle of his chest. He smiled and glanced sideways. Sometimes objects that enhance abilities are not needed. And Pearl fired, saying that the boss wasn't that tough, and the bullet hit the monster's red meat. The great boss howled, falling back, pain engulfing his body, causing a wave of air with its movement. He flashed his eyes, glanced to the side, and opened his mouth. A surprise even for him. Under the pile of stones, the monster began to stir. Some tentacles began to crawl out of his chest. He was getting stronger. Apparently, the second phase was beginning. The monster shrouded in red threads was rising slowly. The guy was covered in dust. He covered himself with his weapon and crossed his arms, laughing at the fact that they had only warned him. Now it seemed to Pearl that he was in complete trouble. He pointed his shotgun. The bullets that were fired at him bounced off as if they were off a wall, and didn't even hit him once. He thought, since the blow hit his arm and did no damage, he would try to shoot him in the chest again. He squinted. "There is no point in farming items," the guy finished tiredly. A man ran away with a shotgun on his shoulder, looking back at the monster, assessing the situation. But then he ducked underneath, raised his weapon and fired right into the middle, into the chest where a red hole gaped. He stood up, stopped, and began to watch as the place where the guy was aiming began to turn green. I looked. Now he will explain why he did not start farming items. Purple eyes flashed. He relaxed, assumed a languid pose with the butt of his rifle on his shoulder, and asked to watch closely. Pearl's eyes lit up yellow. Watch, and now everyone will understand. He slid lower, wielding his dagger, striking at the monster's knee. He explained that the gun was just a way to buy time, but his goal was much higher. Waving a shotgun, he grinned, wanting to use what the mutated rats had used. The Overlord towered over Pearl, but he stood firm. It was even surprising. The monster's eyes flashed. Now everything is calm. The boy exhaled, asked to look at the place where green stones appeared nearby. The monster was pinned down. Some kind of liquid was dripping on him, and the hero was pinning him down with his shotgun. He explained that he was in a place where they were getting rid of experiments, and a shot was fired towards the enemy. Throw away after dissolving, the liquid enveloped the Overlord, bent under the weight. The solution that dissolves corpses flowed from the monster's body. It stood motionless, the skin peeling off along with the liquid. Pearl saw that he was still being reborn. He was amazed by this, and wondered how long he could. He was struck by his attempt to stand up. He was unable to say anything. He raised his leg to step forward. The shotgun was aimed at the Overlord's most secret place, at his weakness, and now the guy is happy. That very height. A shot rang out and scorched the big boss's chest with fire. He recoiled and began to fall onto his back. Defeated the ferocious Overlord, unlocked the hidden ending. Legendary moment. Oh, the developers don't mind, but we shouldn't forget about the rocket launcher. He laughed, turned around, left them to the guys, agreed with this, turned everything into a joke. He looked around the place. It no longer mattered whether experiments were being conducted here or not. It was time for him to move on. I stopped in front of the exit and decided that it was worth going through the closed passage. He timidly slowed down near the stairs. If he walked along them, he would see the ending. I walked around the top floor where research and development was taking place. It was too big a room. He called Jessica and Sandra, but didn't notice how a human figure appeared behind him and was rapidly approaching. Suddenly, her green hair flew up and she hugged her around the waist, holding on tightly. The girl screamed about her fear. He turned his head, opened his mouth, saw Jessica, was surprised by such a reaction, and still did not understand her appearance. Her hair was disheveled. There were tears in her eyes and her face was dirty. She looked as if she wasn't breathing from fear. She pressed herself against him again, hiding her face, and told him about Sandra, that she had suddenly lost her mind. Attacked her and went upstairs. Pearl squinted. A strange premonition did not leave him. He turned around, waved her away, and a question came loudly from the boy. He wanted to figure it out. He headed upstairs. Jessie was trotting after him, shouting bad words about the girl, but he was determined. He had to see for himself. She put her hands to her chin, surprised that they didn't believe her. But she proved that she saw everything with her own eyes. But there was a way out, Jess convinced him. That he needed to become part of the experiment, and then everything would work out. She prayed, folded her hands in a prayerful gesture. Tears appeared in her eyes, and asked him to think carefully. And the hero faced a choice, whether to agree to the experiment or not. It was difficult for him to make a decision, because he was not sure that the girl was telling the truth. But in any case, to save Sandra, a vaccine is needed, he told himself, convinced himself. Jessica closed her eyes contentedly, praising the guy. Finally the right decision, squeezing the black phone in her hand. The guy squinted from the blinding light. The passage was hidden in the wall. He was surprised. And this is where the chapter ends. A door with a blinding light opened in front of the young people. His hand shot up. He smiled. The chapter passed so quickly, even the hero himself was surprised. The guy's face changed, and he stopped playing because he was completely confused. It was late and half the people were gone. But today he wanted to break the rules and go further. He wanted to experience this feeling again, with those who remained with him, and not disappoint them. The guy split into two. It will be a lot of fun. Ben will edit the video anyway. He wondered if he was doing the right thing. Stopped, leaned back and thought, could he do it as usual? Ben monitored his friend, screamed. He also wanted to see the ending, was indignant that he should go further. Pearl laughed and decided to go all the way to the end and finish the game today. All messages were blocked by the moderator. He recoiled, and it was as if something had fallen on the guy from above, and a bright light illuminated everything around. Ben opened the donations, put his hand to his chest and thanked his viewers, always sincerely and joyfully. He saluted with his hand, began to walk through the last chapter, waved to everyone, smiled on such a cheerful note, and continued. Jessica continued on her way. Pearl followed her. There was no choice but to go forward. He raised his hand to his cheek, stared at the secret laboratory, and didn't understand what was there. There were creatures in green flasks all around. The guy looked around in amazement. These were all experiments of the organization. He glanced at Jessica's reflection. It was alive, and surprisingly, the boy looked at it without hiding his interest. The girl explained that these were their early experiments, which gained a little immortality. The elixir is only effective for those who have absolute genetic compatibility, like Logan and Overlord. Jess gave an example. Her boyfriend stopped her. She was not the only one who could become the best. There were others. The glare of her glasses flashed. Her tone gave off madness, and tongs appeared from above. They grabbed him under the girl's angry scream that he had absolute compatibility, and the tongs burst into Pearl's body. The hero opened his eyes and immediately heard a voice about his imminent awakening. It turned out that the man was tied hand and foot and placed in one of the flasks that he had seen earlier. Jessica thanked him sarcastically for his help. She smiled. Now she has to explain how they will make the vaccine and Sandra will be saved. To create the elixir, you need to take the necessary coefficient from Pearl. The tubes were already stretching towards the spine. The girl continued that then only ideal people would survive, and that was the true goal of the organization. Pearl understood what had happened, grinned. He was not frightened or worried about the victims of the people. Eventually, Jessica continued. They found the specimen they needed. The iron tentacles were already rushing towards the guy. Grabbing a syringe with needles, she craved power and to be recognized and welcomed, all that a woman needed. Jess's speech was suddenly interrupted and a shot to her head silenced her, shouting the boy's name. Sandra appeared near the door, in a warlike mood, with a pistol in her hands. Having freed Pearl, he jumped out of the flask, and along the way found out what had happened. She stopped him and said she would tell him everything later. Sandra ran away, only her heels sparkling. Now it became clear to the guy why everyone liked her. But he remembered Jessica and frowned. That feeling of something warning did not go away. They stopped in front of the elevator. Sandra explained that it led up to the director and could only be opened with the card in her hand. She lowered her head and began to tell what happened after Jessica and she went upstairs. She stole the pass while she was fighting off her attacks. Apparently the girl was afraid that it would interfere with her luring Pearl. Slipping below Jess, she made her way into the principal's office, leaving him empty-handed. She showed a photo of the director of the organization. The guy looked closely and found similarities with the research assistant. She was her daughter. She turned away, screamed sharply, grabbed her shoulder, where a blue color was spreading under her skin. She flared up, angrily pointed her finger at the man, and began to scold him for agreeing to the experiment. Pearl's next words surprised the girl. This could save her. She was confused. Suddenly she buried her face in her hand. Sandra began to cry. He exhaled and looked at her. She removed her hand from her face, looked at the guy, smiled shyly. She was glad that he was okay. When they entered, they talked with the man. The girl said that a helicopter had arrived, and they needed to pack everything and leave. They went to find what they needed and quickly get out of there, ran in different directions, looked at each other. He assembled the tablet and held it under his arm. And that's all Pearl was wondering, not understanding what else needed to be done. He came closer to the computer, which turned on abruptly, dropped the documents, and stared at it in shock. I looked at the computer. Everything was password protected. Only one folder was accessible. I pressed the button on it. The man sat down in a chair on the camera, sent the documents, and now waited for help. The man in the police uniform lowered his head in exhaustion. There were so many victims, he lamented. I was upset, but there is something good too, I encouraged myself. Everything will be as before. This is the original ending of the game. People in protective yellow suits grabbed the man by the arms and announced that the sample had been saved. And Jessica is alive. In defense, she announced that the mission was completed. It was time to get ready. She brought the flash card, and it was annoying that it automatically switched to the internal channel. Staring at the camera, Jessica scolded the guy for trusting her. He shouldn't have been so naive. He gasped, surprised by such an original ending. He wanted to experience this from the very beginning. And I didn't know that the flash drive that Jess gave me was so dangerous. I personally checked all the documents and wanted to pass on this information myself. It was time to leave now. Pearl ran ahead. Sandra ran after him, not lagging behind. The helicopter was approaching them. Young people stopped and watched it. People were worried in the chat. Pearl stopped. A feeling washed over him. So strong, he hadn't even experienced this with Overlord. Could he really be the final boss? Standing on the roof, they saw the glow that appeared due to the helicopter explosion. The man knew that everything couldn't be so simple. A transformed Jessica appeared before him. The girl looked at the couple, noticed their surprise, and spat out that she couldn't stand fools. Those same bullets slipped from her fingers. One side of the woman was already turning bluish. Multiple tentacles slid out of her body, lifting her into the air. Completely changing, she looked with one eye and a flash appeared on her lips. Sandra, without holding back her words, began to shoot the girl with a pistol. She hit the ground with one of her tentacles so hard that it scattered to the sides. The shelling didn't help. Holding her hand, Sandra didn't like that she was behaving cowardly. Pearl shouted to the girl that she should come down. He was worried about her and nervous. Covering his girlfriend with himself, he raised himself and took aim. The shots were of no help. Jessica was wrapped in a ball of threads, firmly, and the organization's helicopter was also protecting her. The guy would have a hard time. He narrowed his eyes, took aim, and gave advice to future players to find and use the bonus. I dealt with the helicopter, covered myself from the dust, did everything I could. I missed my chance to give up, Jessie whispered, opening up as if from a cocoon. The evolved overlord, Boss Jessica, smiled ominously. Her face had changed, and now had a symbol on it. Green hair flew up, slid to the side. She needed to get rid of the obstacle first. Beads of sweat ran down Sandra's face. She bit her lips in pain, and her hand became covered in a blue web. The man clenched his teeth with zeal. His hand did not drop. The shots sounded loud. The guy's shots slowed down a bit, and the girl's face became thoughtful. She thanked Pearl for covering her. The pain went away. They will fight together. Jessica could change and control her body much better than before. It will be difficult to cope. There is no point in aiming at her weak spot. All that remains is to keep her at a distance. He understood that he needed something stronger, but there was nothing here. The shotgun was touching the boss. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the thing I needed. Aviation fuel was standing alone to the side. Apparently a spare one, since he was the only one. He threw it to Sandra so that she would catch the weapon. He waved his hand. The shotgun ended up in the girl's hands, asking her to hold on for now. A smile appeared on the young man's lips. The gun had little recoil and could be fired with one hand. The best weapon, Sandra already used it to distract Jessica. He took aim with his pistol. Of course it would help her, and he fired. He ran up to the fuel tank, smiled, touched it, and caught it. The hero lifted it over his head so easily that he was even surprised, and the spectators, the future players, expected more. He laid him on the edge of the roof, pressed him down with his foot, and thought about what to do next. Drops of liquid were flowing out. I looked down, smiled. There it was, and sat there for a while without taking my eyes off it. Below, zombies swarmed like a swarm of ants. There were a lot of them. Hell on earth, the character thought. Held back Sandra enraged Jessica. Shots flew towards the boss. The guy attracted attention with a loud shot and a speech, scolding the girl. She should be faster. If he wants to save his genes, he stepped back, smiling madly, and began to fall towards where the zombies were approaching. With a loud scream, fear in the monster's eyes, she rushed towards the only exception in an attempt to save him. The guy's plan worked. Jessica was trapped. Fire was pouring over her, and the hero grabbed onto a ledge on the wall. He gritted his teeth, took aim, saluted his enemy, and said goodbye to him. I noticed that when they shoot at the head, it freezes. It survived the fire, but the fall is curious. I climbed onto the roof. He sat down on the edge, getting ready to jump. Everything went according to plan. The man rejoiced. Achievement unlocked. He managed to defeat Jessica. Looked down, used a lot of elixir. And everyone was happy. Even the developers were delighted. But turning his head, Pearl remembered the wound. Sandra raised her hand, calming the guy down. Now it was time to think about what would happen next. She was fine, although it was impossible to tell by her appearance. It was necessary to find a way out when Pearl froze from the sounds behind him, frozen. The zombies crawled towards them, approaching each other. They understood that they could not hold out. They had to evacuate. They stood alone at sunset on the roof, surrounded by monsters on all fronts. They tried to shoot back, emptying the clip. Pearl shot with both hands. The bullets tore apart the zombies. When it seemed that everything was over, Even more monsters came out, and it was necessary to sweat to remove them all. It was impossible to cope with one shotgun, and the pistol ran out of bullets. The game tried to force you to use up all the bullets. Sandra, hearing that the ammunition was gone, became wet. She also had few bullets left. She came closer to the guy, standing next to him. They shot back, fire pouring from their weapons. The girl shoved the last of the ammunition into the boy's hands. He didn't understand what was happening or why. She asked him not to give up. She knew that he was capable of holding out, and she didn't have much time left. She put the gun to his head, holding his hands with hers, if it would be easier for him alone. She confessed to Pearl now, with her life hanging by a thread, that Jessica had offered a deal. Then, when they were left alone, the research assistant squinted and was surprised that the infection was spreading slowly and that she should join them. But the girl resisted and would not allow experiments on a man. Then another proposal was made, the purpose of conceiving a child for the exchange of DNA. Jessica chuckled, knowing that Sandra was carrying a child, and laughing, she would tell something interesting. She bowed her head and told about the consequences, but the girl apparently guessed about it herself. By joining them, she and the child will survive, and the experiment will not kill the officer. Jess's eyes lit up. The right choice, and then everyone will stay alive. Of course the offer was tempting, but I didn't believe it, and I did the right thing. It's known where Jessica would have kept it. She pressed herself against him and shot together, repeating the guy's words that he had told her. She laughed. Now it was her best decision, and she didn't regret anything. She would prefer that the guy live and remember her, rather than become an experiment. She pressed it tightly to her forehead again. Her last wish. She didn't want to turn into a monster. And there was no regret, because the time spent with Pearl was the best. He closed his eyes and did not see her tears. Sandra was engulfed in a glow, threw up her hands and awkwardly backed away. Now they were again shooting back at the attacking zombies, wasting their last bullets. Suddenly, a man in a black suit landed from a helicopter above. He deftly and quickly dealt with the remaining zombies, firing from his gun. Without turning his head, he asked the young people about the bite. Lifting the girl, the hero answered for everyone. He carefully held Sandra, ran to the helicopter, and suddenly everything ended for them. The man shouted that he would cover them as the stairs were already descending. Later, when they sat down, the couple did not look happy, even though they had survived. Sandra screamed after hearing the man's remark, pointed the gun at him. Doubts overwhelmed her. The man laughed, pulling his helmet off his head, forgot to introduce himself and apologized. The man flashed a smile. His name was Leon Kim, and lowered his protective helmet. He explained that he used to be a police officer, but now he is a military man. Pearl opened his mouth in surprise and assumed that he was in some special army unit. Lion explained that their location was found out from a drone. Hearing this, the guy handed over the tablet, and now passed the information on to the right people. Taking it in his hands, the soldier stared, speechless, important evidence, even a little confused. I'm sure there was a lot we could share while I was offering a rest. We looked away while hovering above. Brilliant work. Lion liked everything. The epilogue for the character was unlocked, staring with interest. The man in black listened attentively to the report while the people were figuring out the computer. He squeezed his hand, raised his head, and in the end, Jessica couldn't cope. Regret was evident in his voice. Having connected the main computer, the Infinity Project started working. The information was transmitted. Fox ordered the city to close as planned. Thanked all my viewers. See you now on the next broadcast. He already gave the usual salute with his hand, smiled, sponsored stream. Ben stretched while sitting on a chair. This story is very heartbreaking. Leaner asked about his friend's health, and he leaned over in his chair, tired. The guys stared at the voting results while sipping their drinks through a straw. Ben explained why there were so few votes, because the stream ended, people leave the channel. Leaner thought, everyone initially came to watch the game. It will be a shame if the number of viewers decreases. Closing the laptop, Ben asked in a businesslike manner what game the boy would like to play next. Showed an example of games, confirmed that the channel must have a clear identification in order to get into the algorithms. He admitted that for a short moment he felt like himself again, and folded his hands on his knees. I remember the feeling he had when he played this game. Fun. Thankful for the votes, but he will play what he chooses himself. Then the streams will be more fun. He scratched his neck. Even if the relationship between them changes, he will not back down. Ben asked with interest that he wants to play. I thought about it and started to think that I would like to play an online game with several people. Hearing this, my friend rubbed his face. It wasn't a very good idea. I didn't quite understand. I pointed the glass of drink in Ben's direction, whether this was a bad idea or not. The boy's answer surprised the hero. He even opened his mouth as if he hadn't heard. He leaned over and looked with a sly smile. The guy said, "You can pull the audience over." He stood up, holding the laptop above his head. Let him do whatever he wants. Ben will try to get everything ready. Linar sat on the floor, so disconcerted that he was speechless. He just looked with his eyes wide open. He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and exhaled agreement and his demand. He folded his arms, laughed, and suggested playing the game on the weekend without streaming. His whole body trembled. His friend didn't understand why he didn't want to, because on days like these there are usually a lot of people. He fell silent in surprise as soon as he heard that the boy was worried and caring about him. Pointing his finger at Ben, Linar began listing his greasy hair and dirty clothes. He leaned back on the nightstand. The guy closed his eyes and smiled, feeling like the head of a black company. A bead of sweat rolled down Ben's cheek. Linar owed a lot to this boy. He grabbed the refrigerator, leaned on it, immediately became arrogant and felt strength within himself. Watching him, the character began to drool. There was too much information, even tired. He turned around and had a reliable person in mind who should be made a manager. Showed this person on the tablet, he will be loyal to them, even despite not understanding the streams. A man wearing glasses was walking down the street under an umbrella and was indignant about his job, which he ended up quitting. The figure kept moving away. He could have been with him until the end, but he had no intention of covering for him. Throwing down his suitcase and throwing aside his umbrella, he stood in the pouring rain and exhaled. Beads of sweat were running down my face. I didn't lower my head. I was too tired and just wanted to rest. Entering the room, I was surprised that it was so dark and squinted. He stopped and noticed that there was someone near his house, and wondered what had happened. Ben and Linar shone a flashlight into the door lock, did not notice how the man approached, but felt the aura emanating from him. They turned around, smiled. They needed to come in and talk. They were just waiting for him. They went inside, indignantly grumbled about the old password. Nothing had changed. The man with the drink looked up when he heard the offer to become their manager. By pouring him alcohol, they advertised their actions. He understood everything and stopped. Hand on forehead, thought, all this is good, but this is not a permanent job, especially for a career. If it weren't for them, he would have refused. But looking at the guys who were having fun and handing him a drink, Ben looked and touched Linar's shoulder, whispering that he would have to do everything himself. He folded his arms across his chest and resolutely asked about salary. All issues needed to be discussed. He showed the tablet with a smile. Ben was talking about this not useless offer. The man with black hair thoughtfully rubbed his chin and read attentively. Clench your fist. Within a week, the number of subscribers grows and money accumulates. He leaned towards the guy, winked at him, and confirmed that he too was surprised that fun could turn into money. It's intuitive, Linar laughed, that they received sincere support, and that's why they want to be even more diligent. Ben grabbed the guy by the neck and laughed too. Let their future manager make a decision quickly. They stared at him expectantly, because they wanted to take him with them because of his attitude to work. Memories took him away from all the times when it was difficult for him. They appeared every time. He lowered his head and exhaled, the same as in high school and now. Beg already tried to hug because he saw the smile, but he turned away and still pretended that he needed to think. Linar removed his friend, kept him at a distance, asked him to try. It was vacation anyway. He grinned. Everything had already been decided. But quitting his job wasn't easy yet, and he raised his drink. They came to a common opinion, but Linar attracted the attention of his friends, causing them to freeze. He built a tower, and it turned out as if he had accidentally started talking about the next game. He chose a game that had special meaning for him, and when he appeared online, he explained his choice. And today's game, he pointed with his hand, is the Mystical League. Staring at the conversation in the chat, many decided to leave did not like the choice. He closed his eyes, accepting their decision, because few agreed with his choice this time. The man greeted his pearls again and smiled cheerfully. He sat down right in the air. He was impatient to play, and so he went out alone. He folded his hands, shook them, and joyfully announced his greeting. He threw his hands up and a new family member, the manager, appeared in them. The main topic of today is choosing a game, stood up and started talking about watching all the videos. Finally, putting his hand on his hip, he pointed up. The game will be a mystical league. According to the vote, this game was at the very end of the list, the continuation in virtual reality. Becoming the character himself, you can enjoy the game. There was some indignation in the chat. There are a lot of fans of story-driven games among the viewers. That's why they don't like it. He put his hand to his face, remembered his school life, and there he was offered to join the professional team Lola. He scratched his head, unable to talk about his illness here, so he referred to family circumstances. That's why he wants to play this game. He put one hand to his chest and stretched out the other. Playing the game for the first time, suggested playing energetically, looking at the splash screen. As soon as I made my choice, the boy turned yellow and ended up in the right place. And now, 10 years later, Back in the game, signs appeared, notifying the choice of action. He looked up. He would become a jungler, but he was interested in his teammates. The men discussed Linar's actions, and the manager noted with displeasure that the adjustment was different. Ben leaned back in his chair. Their friend hadn't changed at all, he informed the guy. If he wasn't a good player, he wouldn't have been called into the league. He can read cards. The man continued talking about the game and Linara when Lenny rushed to the computer. As soon as he saw who the boy had chosen, he began to sweat as he stared at the screen. He chose Yami, who is very good at foresight, a ninja, a great character. This character, who specializes in magical assassinations, has 5 different skills. There was one thing. The character, although good, would have a hard time in battle, since he would have to implement the transformation himself. Can't even perform a basic attack because he can't use his arms while transforming. The selected hero will be linked to the account's default avatar, and so they were greeted on the mystical battlefield. The time of waiting was chosen. The other characters caught Yami's attention, but it was not at all what they were telling him. He rolled his eyes and laughed. He didn't think his game character was so lame. I was just about to enter into the discussion, but was interrupted by the appearance of the mission. The fair-haired youth couldn't resist choosing such a long mission. He slid along the ground, delighting the spectators, showing off his agility before them. Giving the order for a perfect victory, he galloped onto the battlefield, leaving his own behind. He waved his hand, smiling and turning his head towards them. The bus is leaving. There is no way out. And smugly, enjoying the game, he rushed into the very heat. Large predatory animals crept up on the man who was shining a dagger. He looked around and assessed how the world had changed. 3-headed wolves were slowly approaching him. They secluded themselves, jumping from all sides. Learning should be fun, he thought. So I decided to try it in my own style and smiled. He looked out. It wouldn't hurt him to concentrate in order to gain the necessary skills. Divine hands were drawing hints for him on top, the man thought. Pictures appear in the head, and the senses perceive the emerging movements. With his arms spread out to the sides, he should be able to do it, as if he had learned everything. He lit up with yellow light, folded his hands into a lock and put them forward. His eyes were shining. He tried the power of healing on the animals, and with their mouths open they rushed. The appearance of the stone monster above him caused delight. The assimilation of the 3rd level. The 3-headed dogs fell on their backs, stuck out their tongues, and no longer showed any signs of life. He glanced sideways. A smile appeared on his lips. He was pleased with his action. The dagger appeared in his hands. He did not understand what kind of feeling he was experiencing. Jump after jump, he had already gotten used to the rocks and wanted more, and offered to follow him. The iron-red robot attacked his comrades, who ran away from him screaming. The guy in white cried out, "Their health is at a minimum. They are in danger." It was not possible to repel the attack, and therefore everything went wrong. The robot threw the characters to the sides. The guy in white was surprised when a ninja appeared above and immediately rushed to attack. The hero applied the 4th level throat attribute, Endless Attack. Yami cast a spell with his hands, urging himself to be faster. The comrades, seeing this, began to help, surrounded the attacker and decided where to inflict harm. The ninja cried out that it would be better to cut them out himself. There was no point in interfering. The hero used the next attribute that he managed to learn, putting up protection with iron armor. The appearance of the little knights of defense was an unexpected phenomenon. The chakra recovery was complete, and the boy was able to hit the robot's body. Used the next attribute, Fire Cut, passed the fireball in his hands. Yami went down, played perfectly, no one else could do that, mission accomplished. The guy stopped. His teammates were already rushing towards him. He looked around at his business. He waved his hand, went to another line, decided to take up the front, and only his jumps were visible. He turned around already in mid-jump. Now he understood. A happy smile lit up his face. The lights of his rage flashed as he tore apart his enemies, and a heated argument was going on in the chat. He applied new skills and abilities, and a water snake slid along his hand. I was upset when Yami prepared to attack, but the player gave up and went to base. He showed with his fingers that he needed 4 victories to be completely successful, and then success was guaranteed. The player admitted that the next match would be even more interesting, and began to dissolve. The player destroyed the temples and won every time. Only 3 people remained. Ben exhaled, folded his arms across his chest, and smugly noted that Linar was playing well. Their friend thought he had almost finished everything, adjusted his glasses, and did not take his eyes off the screen. Ben stretched in his chair and admitted that this would be their 5th victory. I went back to look at the screen and screamed in horror. I didn't want him to go there. The guy ran forward, not really thinking about how he looked. He needed to hurry. Freezing in the air, drawing his blades. It seems he has a serious opponent. On the other side was a guy with a lot of followers, Genome, with cards in his hands. Red eyes flashed, and a smile appeared on his lips. He turned to the guys. He turned to look at his sign, was pleased to notice that he was at a high level, and gave me a smile. Noticed that a guy from the team was supposed to show up here and the route was planned. Having killed the wolves with his playing cards, the guy reasoned about what and how should happen to the jungler. I stopped, seeing something on my cards, and already doubted the correctness of my choice. Yami was not the best choice. I got angry, squeezed my hand with the map. I didn't understand why they create such characters at an important moment. Even in the chat, viewers understood that the character was very angry, as the streamer himself did not understand the point of creating something useless. A mission sign appeared in front of Genome. He had to kill Yami and earn money. The character was surprised when he found out that the chat was blocked. He was speechless. As the level rose, everyone became suddenly serious. The boy raised his head and announced. He smiled. He just wanted a mission, but the chat was blocked. Our hero thought it was not right. The boy hid, looked out in search of the enemy, but did not see him on the line. He thought that he would gank. Magic shooter, the character thought. There shouldn't be any hidden abilities. But the feeling of danger appeared suddenly. The deck of cards was thrown out abruptly, throwing the boy aside, leaving a trail of flight behind them. The man in black covered himself with cards and praised Yami for dodging attacks well. Assessed the location of Genome, believed that he was able to predict his movements. Breaking the prolonged silence, the enemy simply decided to throw cards into the attack, and the battle began. He warned that there were no personal motives. He was just following the instructions, and cards fell out of his open hand and rushed towards the guy. He tried to repel the attack, concentrating magic balls in Yami's hands to repel the blow. A smile appeared on the guy's lips. The return throw and the response words were the same. He also had no intention. The forces were equal. The attacks became more intense. Only Genome underestimated his opponent. With a blade in his hands, he attacked Genome from behind, remaining silent and not paying attention to him. A sharp turn and a grin from the opponent. The throwing out of cards repelled Yami's attack. He flew to the side, used the iron attribute. Its power grew with each time, but it was not enough. He applied attribute after attribute, and now the invisible vines of the card player twisted, binding him tightly. The enemy was also strong. He broke free from the bonds that bound him, laughed. He found it funny. He looked at his health bar and thought that if things continued like this, he would be in trouble. Yami's forces demanded mana. He looked around the area with a doomed gaze, as if trying to figure out where to get strength. But the enemy was doing well, but his deck required constant shuffling of the cards. He dodged and eluded him, but chose the most opportune moment when Genome was advancing on Yami. The hero's eyes flashed brightly. He grabbed the dagger and decided to use something else. The guy cried out indignantly and stopped. He didn't expect that this would happen. Reality was not like that. His skills were much better than he thought, but he still considered this game character useless. His body was already warmed up, so I rushed to attack. I wanted to finally finish him off. He stopped, having lost sight of the enemy, looked around, noticed the bushes and thought he was hiding. He fell for it, got distracted and threw down the cards, his red eyes flashing, a smile appearing on his lips ahead of time. Laughed at the guy who used the restored mana in vain. Now he will put an end to everything. With a surprised look, I watched the attack that was coming from all sides and was also accelerating. He smiled as he turned the deck of cards in his hand, and realized that there were monsters in the thicket. The smile immediately turned into a grin, and he cursed when he noticed that the toothy creatures were now surrounding him. Along with the monsters, Yami also attacked him from above, flashing his weapon. While casting the spell, he directed it, oddly enough, not at the man, but at the monsters, and they crumbled to dust. The guy looked at the enemy with admiration. In such a short time he was able to restore chakra with the help of the animals, and distract him with their help. The character used the third-level fire attribute to finally put an end to all this. Yami's perfect game. He came down to earth. Mission accomplished, the blue window said. He smiled, saw that people had sent him a donation, and thanked everyone. He clutched sharp blades in his hands, a smile never leaving his lips. The game was not over yet, so he was returning. He flashed his eyes and said that he would give orders if he turned on the microphone. I looked ahead. It was good. Now there is no need to be distracted by those who are in the chat and write to them. After that, jump again while running and forward to destroy one of the lines while Genome is defeated. An elusive spirit, a true master of stealth. All this was said about our character. During the flight, Genome was thinking about his own thoughts, about how the white team had really changed, and very much so. He had a desire to set a trap, and after scanning the map he identified the most successful places. The red eyes gave off madness. If Yami was not killed, then they themselves would die. The mouth opened in silent laughter. Having emerged from the bushes, our hero hissed indignantly about the stones in the thickets, while tightly clutching his blades. I knew that elusive objects were a classic, but I thought this was something incredible. Yami stopped in front of the red spots that were everywhere, and realized that these were traps. A feeling of acute danger enveloped the man. This feeling rose from his feet. The entire enemy team was flying towards him, sparkling and shimmering with their enormous power. They all, led by the card player, came to kill Yami, grinned and held his favorite cards in his hands.